All right, let's talk about synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript code. The term synchronous, I like to think of it as like things occurring at the same time. I always think about like synchronous swimming where everyone's like just doing all the same things at the exactly same time. But in code and programming, synchronous code means things occurring one right after another. And JavaScript is what is called a single-threaded programming language in that it can only execute one thing at a time. There's other languages that are multi-threaded that can perform multiple tasks at the same time, but JavaScript is not one of them. And what it means by single-threaded is that it only allocates one part of the CPU or one thread on the CPU to perform a task. Whereas asynchronous code is things that don't necessarily have to execute in order. So if we think about like writing some code from top to bottom, JavaScript, it's gonna execute top and go down. So top, execute the first line, second line, third line, all the way down to the bottom. So if you think of it as if we just declare like let A equals like 6, let B equals 10, let C equals like 15. When I run this code, if I console log A, B, C, and run this code in the terminal, node sync async. Now, why does it do that? It executes, comes in here, declares a variable A, assigns a value of 6, declares a variable B, assigns a value of 10, and declare a variable C, and assigns a value of 15, and then it comes over here and console logs A, B, C. Every time I execute this, it'll always execute these console logs in order. They'll never be out of order. So you'll never have this A or B execute before A or C execute before B. That's synchronous code. But when you're working with JavaScript and the front end and the browser and servers and grabbing data from the servers, things don't always happen in order. So for example, if you are logging into a website and type your login, username, and password and click submit, if you had to wait before the page redirected to, I don't know, the log, like the profile page or just like the dashboard before you received a request or before you received a response back from the server saying like, hey, you're successfully logged in or not, like it could take quite a while. Or when when you're logging in and you see a little loader, like what if you had to wait before that loader even showed up on the screen before data even came back from the server? So that's where asynchronous code comes in. So let me go back and we can simulate asynchronous code in here. So I'm going to declare, there's a method called set timeout that takes in a callback. And I'm going to say like, hey, if A plus B is greater than 20, I want to console log completed, else console log rejected. And this set timeout takes in what this is called the callback and another parameter of how long it takes before it actually executes this callback. So 1,000 milliseconds. If I execute this in the terminal, so it's going to come in here, declare variable A 6, declare variable B 10, comes in here, runs this set timeout, it's executing it, It waits 1 second, and then it will execute this block of code. So if I clear and run that, it takes 1 second, and now it's rejected because 6 plus 10 is not greater than 20, so it comes down here to reject it. But if I want to reassign that variable to 12, the variable a to 12, and execute that, will be completed or rejected. So it comes into here. Let's see this. So I'm simulating asynchronous code now. So it comes in here, completed. Completed. So it comes in here, assigns a variable a 6, variable b 10, executes this set timeout, comes immediately down here, declares a variable or reassigns a variable a to 12, and after 1 second, it executes this block of code, this function. And at that time, a is now 12. So 12 plus 10 is greater than 20, therefore it's completed. So we just simulated asynchronous code where things don't necessarily execute in order. Now let's talk about how we deal with asynchronous code in JavaScript. So I'm going to create another file called promise. There we go. So in JavaScript, there is a JavaScript object similar to that as like a class object in Python. There's a reserved JavaScript object called a promise. And a promise, if you think about it, what is a promise in the real world? Like a promise is, if I promise to do something, like if I say, I promise I'm going to wash the dishes by Friday, that means, all right, I made a promise, and either I'm going to complete that promise by Friday, or I'm not going to complete it by Friday. So it's either it's going to be completed or it's going to be rejected. And the time between now and Friday, the promise is neither completed or rejected. It's currently pending because I haven't fulfilled the promise yet, but I haven't like not, or I haven't, it's not past the deadline of when the promise was due. So a promise, I'm going to say const my promise. And the way you declare or invoke a JavaScript object similar to that of like a class in Python. If this was Python, I'd be like my promise, and it'd be like a promise, and I'd invoke it. But this is JavaScript, so I'm going to say, hey, new promise. That's how you invoke a JavaScript object. And this promise takes in a callback. And this JavaScript, or this promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of a promise or of an asynchronous operation, some asynchronous code that may or may not be completed. So it takes in this arrow function. I'm just creating an arrow function. And this callback takes in two functions. What happens when I resolve the promise, or what happens when I reject the promise. So if I complete the promise on time, it'll come into here and resolve it. Otherwise, I'll reject the promise. Great. So let's do some logic in here. I'm going to say let random time equals math.floor. So I'm just going to math.random So I'm gonna let's say 5. So there 7 seconds. So this is gonna pick a random time between 1 second and 7 seconds. Now I'm just gonna also pick just a random number between 1 and 10. All right. So I can I'm going to create another set timeout, and that takes in a callback. I'm going to say, hey, if the random number is greater than or equal to 3, I'm going to console log. I'm just say like, hey, data is received. And I'm going to return, or this is, if it's greater than 3 or greater than or equal to 3, I want it to resolve the promise. So I'm going to resolve the promise. And this is what I pass into the resolve is what do I actually want to return when this promise is resolved. So I can return any kind of data I want. I'm just going to say here is some data. So I'm just going to return a string that says here is some data. Else I'm going to reject it. And in this rejection, I'm just going to return a string that says 500 internal server error. All right. And then inside the set timeout, I'm going to pass in this random time because it's going to pick up, it's going to execute some random time. And then down here, I'm going to say console log, just waiting for promise to resolve or reject. Great. So now if I execute this, my promise, and just see what happens. I'm just going to come down here. So node promise. So waiting for a promise to resolve. So it's waiting. Is it going to resolve or reject? We're going to find out. Uh-oh, what happened? Internal server error, unhandled promise rejection. This error originated either by throwing inside of an async function without a catch block. Okay, I don't know what that means. So what happens if the promise doesn't resolve? So if there's an error, I need to catch that error and do something with it. So I can do dot catch error. I'm going to console log error. I'm just going to hard code this random number initially to something less than 3, so 1. And we'll go back to make it a random number just because I want to see it reject. Waiting for promise to resolve or reject. Internal server error. Great. So when I get an error, when I return this reject, it goes into what is this catch method. So it catches any errors when it rejects, when that promise rejects. But what happens if, let's see, I'm going to make this greater than 3 now, just to see what happens when I act. What do I want to do when the promise resolves? So waiting for promise to resolve or reject. Data received. Cool. But it didn't do it. But what do I want to? So I received the data, but I didn't do anything with the data. So here is some data. So I didn't do anything with that. So after I receive the data, I'm going to want to somehow grab this data from the resolve resolve function. So just like I did with the catch, where I'm catching any errors when it rejects, I need to catch any data that is when the promise successfully resolves. And that is done through a .then. So after I fulfill my promise, and then what? So I clean the dishes, I promise to give you $1 million, then what? Then what are you going to do with that $1 million? Or what are you going to do with that data? I promise to give you some sort of data at some point in the future. Great, you're waiting for it. All right. Then okay, cool. I successfully gave you that data. Now what do you want to do with it? So I'm going to do a .then. And this .then takes in a function, which is the response of the resolve. So right now, this is what I'm resolving to. Here's some data. And I can return, I can do any kind of logic in here, but instead of using just the old fashioned, the old school way of writing functions, I'm going to again do it kind of like a fat arrow function here. And if you've never seen, so you've seen fat arrow functions with the parentheses, but if you're only passing in one argument, you don't need parentheses around the fat arrow function. So same with these .then. After I resolve this function, I'm going to pass the response, which is here is some data, into this callback. So response. And now I can console log the response. And then also I can like return the response. Or I can do so like perform some logic, like if response is something, do something, but I want to return the response. So if I clear the screen, the terminal, waiting for promise to resolve or reject, I don't know whether, oh yeah, it's gonna resolve. So waiting for the promise to resolve or reject, right down here, comes up here, goes into the set timeout. I'm just simulating something that takes some time to resolve or reject. I can say, so 5 is greater than or equal to 3. That's true. So it comes in here, data received, and then it returns the resolve function, or executes the resolve method. And I'm passing in, here are some data. So that's like if I had some actual data, like an object or just an array, I can pass it in there. And then, so I resolve the function, the promise. Cool. Now, then I'm going to take whatever the resolved promise response is, and I'm console logging here. That's where here is some data. That's where I'm actually console logging. Here is some data because I'm passing in here is some data into the .then as an argument. So here's some data in the response, and then I'm console logging that, and then I'm just returning the response. And then I can literally just keep on chaining this together. I can do, all right, then what? I'm going to take that response, res short for response, console log that response, So I'll actually do some string interpolation, response. Oh. 1. Res, I'm going to say 2. So I'm going to run that again, waiting for the promise to resolve or reject. Here's some data. So I can keep passing the response on. So I can do .then. I can just chain these .then. Then what? Well, here I can return like, all right, return the number 20 just for the hell of it. So I can return that 20, and I'm passing that return 20 into this .then, res dot console log, say like 3, and then res. I'll clear it. And so I can keep on doing that. I can keep on chaining the dot thens on my promise. And this is good because, for example, if I go to log in to Facebook or Instagram or Reddit or, you know, something, I click login. I'm waiting for that response. So I'm going to the server with my username and password. All right, it's checking the server. It's checking, it's validating my credentials. All right, it says, okay, you can log in. Cool. I pass in I come in here, I get that response. Okay, now what do you want to do? Well, maybe there's other information on the web page that needs to, maybe there's other information that I need to get after I log in. So say I log in, get my username and password, I log in, great, I go to the home page. Maybe there's some photos on the home page that belong to me. That's another API or another HTTP request that I have to go and grab all my photos or all my comments or something. So after I log in, great. Now what? All right, then I can go grab, you know, my photos. All right, then what? Maybe then I want to grab all my comments or posts. Okay, then what? Then I want to do something else. So that's where promises are. So let's talk about, I'm going to touch app.js and index.html. So why do these promises exist? And like, why should we use them, or where are we actually going to use them? This is where the fetch API comes in. The fetch API returns a promise. So it returns a promise. So we can use the same syntax, the .then. So I'm going to code app.js and index.html. And I'm going to quickly create, I'm just going to create a button. Fetch data from API. I'm going to order a list. li ID equals item. And I'm going to console log JS loaded. So I'm just going to make sure the JS is loaded. I'm going to import my JavaScript into my HTML down here in the script tag. And now I'm going to open index.html. I'm going to bring it over here. So here is my HTML, and here is my script that's loaded, my JavaScript that's loaded. So in my JavaScript, I'm going to fetch some actual data from the web and display it here. So there's this JSON placeholder that can simulate, or not simulate, you can perform HTTP requests on and grab data back just test your application with, etc. So for example here, so the fetch JavaScript. So the fetch API is literally a reserved method in JavaScript that, so you can, a method that provides an easy logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. So here's an example. So the fetch API returns a promise. So we can, so let's just check this out. I'm going to copy that over here. Like so, I'm going to comment that out. And I'm going to fetch to, actually, I'll use this instead of. So this is what I actually want to do. Let's comment that out. Oh. So what I'm going to do is when I click this button, I want to fetch whatever data from this API endpoint. And I can actually copy this and put it directly in the web browser and see what data comes back. You can see this is JSON data. And I can use this and parse it and insert it into my HTML. So if I make an API request to this URL, it'll return this JSON data. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So when I click this button, so I have to do, I have to interact with the DOM using JavaScript. So I'm gonna let button document dot get element. I could add an ID. I'm gonna do get element by tag name, which returns an array of tags with the button, array of elements that wait, nope, get out button. There we go. So this is looking for any tags that are buttons. It's going to return an array, and I'm just going to use grab the first element from there. So I can console log button just to make sure that that is in fact working. So here's my button right there. You can see it highlighted. And when I click on that, so I'm going to add an on-click event handler. So I can do that a couple ways. I can do it like add event listener click, or I can just do button.onClick. I'm going to execute a function that says return get data. Oh, get data. And this get data method, get data, is going to fetch. That's where I'm going to fetch. Use a fetch API and return, or not return. Whoop. I'm going to go to this API endpoint, fetch that data, and let's see. I'm just going to do that. Oh, what happened? Oh, there we go. If I click it, nothing happens. So that's where I want to use. All right, I clicked it. Now what do I want to do? I want to do .then. I want to wait for the response to come back because the response could take a long time depending on how long the server takes to return these to-dos, the ID of the to-do item with an ID of 1. And then I can console log the response. So if I click it, here's the response that I'm getting back from that URL. I've got the body, I've got body used false, I've got the headers, and I can even look at my network to see right here. I made a request to this URL. Here's my request headers, authority JSON placeholder, the path, it's a get request, and the response is right here, and the response headers, and I can look at the actual response body right there. So that's what I'm getting back, similar to that right here. But now what do I actually want to do with that? I can, let's see. I need to turn that response into that JSON into a JavaScript object so I can actually manipulate it. Because right now it's in JSON. Now I need to, so actually let's do this. I'm gonna say console log fetching data, console log, there's the response. I'm gonna say received response. Now, so I received the response. Now I need to parse that response into something JavaScript can, something that JavaScript can handle. So now parse the response. And I can do that by returning the response.json. So this turns it into, parses that response into a JavaScript object. All right. So if I click that again, so fetching data, got the response, I'm console logging the response. I received the response, now parse the response. All right. So I can, maybe my intuition is like, all right, I parsed the response, let parsed response equals that, and I'm going to console log the parsed response and then return the parsed response. Let's see what that looks like. Whoa, it's not quite what. So I'm look when I parse the response. So I parse the response, I assigning response.json to parse response variable. I'm console logging the parse response and then I'm returning the parse response. But when I'm console logging the parse response, looks like it says promise pending. But it says promise state is fulfilled. The promise is pending because this response.json, this can take a while. And right now, like when I assign it to response or parse response, it may have not have actually parsed the response yet. So the promise is still pending. But what we can do to alleviate that is just do a .then on that. So after I'm done actually parsing the response, so return parse response or response.json. So I'm going to return that. And then once that is done parsing, I can do a .then. I'm going to just say data, and you can call these whatever you want. It doesn't have to be response and data. You can call this anything you want. But just typically, this is in fact the response from the HTTP. This is the HTTP response. And then I want to return the data. So console.log, returning the data to the front end. So once it's actually done parsing that response, like turning it into a JavaScript object, when that's done, I pass it back into data, and then I can do something with the data. And I can say console log data as well. Cool. Now if I click that button, so fetching data, I'm console logging the response received, now parse the response. Okay, now the data is now parsed. Now I can return the data to the front end. And now down here, I'm also console logging the data. So there we got that JavaScript object. But at the very end of this, I need to make sure that if there's any errors that occur when I'm making in this entire process, in the promise, I can catch any errors. So catch console.error. I'm just doing a console.error. There's a bunch of different console.log, console.table, console.error. Cool. So once I'm done returning the data, maybe I can do something with the data instead of just console logging it, because I'm not doing anything with the front end. So maybe I can say, hey, let item equals document dot get element by ID item. So I'm going to grab this element right here by this ID and say, hey, item dot inner HTML equals data. I'm going to look at this data dot title. And there we go. So now I'm actually displaying the title. And if I want, you can even console log it. So you can get an array of items. So now you can even do something even more interesting. You can say let, well, I don't want to do that. It'll take a while. But you can also, so we've got to-dos. You can grab the photos and then just console log the data here. And you can see, let's see how long it takes to get the photos. So there's 5,000 photos. So that's how long it took to get a response back for 5,000 photos. That's pretty quick. Usually it's not that quick. It might take a few seconds. So you can actually look through all that. Cool. So photos. Maybe if I do one. Cool. So if I do photos 1 and grab the title URL, yeah, like photos/1, and then item dot inner text data title. Refresh that. There's the title. So the dot then just takes in the response from whatever, or the return, yeah, essentially whatever is returned from this. So that's the response. And then whenever I return this, gets passed into this dot then, and so on and so forth. That's a little bit about asynchronous, synchronous, asynchronous, JavaScript promises, and the fetch API.